Regarding the upcoming project, I believe we are prepared to move forward.
I just wanted to say good morning.
Not now. Keep this man in the lower guest lobby. My husband has a habit of showing up uninvited, and I won't have a low-earning freelancer ruining our corporate transition.
Sir, if you could just wait downstairs.
She had no idea the man she just had thrown out of the lobby owned the building she was standing in.
The coffee in my hand was still hot when my wife looked straight through me like I was a stain on the marble floor. I want you to remember that moment, because everything that happened after it, the betrayal, the money, the handcuffs, started right there, in the lobby of a building I secretly owned. My name is Kaelen Vance. For 3 years, the people running Ethelgard Global had no idea that the anonymous offshore investor who quietly bought a majority stake in their company was me, the same man they saw as an unemployed nobody living off his wife's salary. I built that disguise on purpose. I wanted to watch how people behaved when they thought no one important was looking. I never expected my own wife to be the one who taught me the answer. That morning, I'd walked into the glass atrium of Ethelgard Tower, wearing an old leather jacket and jeans, carrying a coffee for Genevieve, the way I did most mornings. It was a small habit, the kind of thing that made me feel useful on days when I had nothing official to do. Jen was standing near the private executive elevators, deep in conversation with Julian Sterling, the company's slick-talking VP of Finance. They were discussing the arrival of the company's reclusive new majority owner, a man neither of them had ever seen, because that man was standing 15 feet away holding a cup of coffee. I smiled and started walking toward her. Jen turned, saw me, and her face changed instantly. Not surprise, not warmth. Disgust. "Not now," she said, before I could even open my mouth. "I just wanted to say good morning," I said, holding up the coffee like a peace offering. She didn't take it. She didn't even look at it. Instead, she raised her hand and waved over the chief of security, a broad-shouldered man named Reyes, who I'd nodded to in passing dozens of times. "Keep this man in the lower guest lobby," she told him, not once looking me in the eye. "My husband has a habit of showing up uninvited, and I won't have a low-earning freelancer ruining our corporate transition." The words hit harder than I expected. Low-earning freelancer. That's what she called me. The man who owned 40% more of this company than she'd ever guess, standing there like an idiot with cooling coffee in his hand. Julian didn't even bother hiding his smirk. He adjusted his cufflinks and said something to Jen I didn't catch, and she laughed. A light, easy laugh, the kind she used to save for me. Reyes stepped beside me, apologetic but firm. "Sir, if you could just wait downstairs." I could have ended it right there. I could have pulled out my phone, shown him the ownership documents, and watched Jen's face collapse in front of the entire lobby. Part of me wanted to. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 years building patience like a muscle, wanted to know how far this would go. I wanted to know what she'd say next, what she'd do next, when she thought her husband was nobody and her secret boss hadn't arrived yet. So I let it happen. I let security walk me past the marble reception desk, past the gleaming Ethelgard logo etched into glass, past a dozen employees who glanced at me with the kind of pity reserved for men who don't belong somewhere. I heard the elevator doors chime behind me. When I turned around, Gen and Julian were already gone, rising toward the executive floor together, standing just a little too close, her hand resting just a little too long on his arm. The lower guest lobby was a bench near the loading entrance, tucked behind a pillar so visitors like me wouldn't be seen by anyone who actually mattered. I sat down, the coffee now lukewarm in my hand, and I thought about the last 3 years of my marriage. The late nights she claimed were board prep. The trips to Singapore, she said, were just work. The way she'd stopped asking what I did with my days, as if my answer had become irrelevant the moment her paycheck grew larger than mine. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things. Then my phone buzzed. It was a calendar reminder, one I'd set for myself weeks earlier, a private one, invisible to anyone else at Ethelgard. Tomorrow, at the emergency shareholders meeting, the company's true majority owner was scheduled to reveal himself for the first time. Me. I looked up at the elevator banks, at the private executive floor Jen had just disappeared into with another man, and something cold settled into my chest. Whatever she thought she could get away with in the next 24 hours, whatever plan she and Julian believed was airtight, none of it accounted for the man they'd just left waiting on a bench like a stranger. I finished the coffee myself. It was terrible, gone cold. I barely noticed, because sitting there, humiliated and forgotten in my own building, I made a decision. I wasn't going to walk in tomorrow and simply reveal who I was. I was going to find out exactly what my wife and Julian Sterling were hiding first, and then I was going to make sure they understood, in front of everyone, just how badly they'd misjudged the man they left waiting in the lobby. I had no idea yet how deep it went. I had no idea about the $40 million, the shell company, or the plan to put my name on their crimes. All I knew, as I stood up and walked out into the afternoon sun, was that Genevieve Vance had just made the last mistake of her career. I didn't go home. Home felt like the wrong place to be when your entire marriage had just cracked open in front of a security guard. Instead, I found a bench outside Ethelgard Tower, pulled out my phone, and logged into the company's encrypted internal network using credentials nobody at the company knew belonged to me. To the IT department, I existed only as a numbered access key, Owner Node 1, a ghost account that watched everything and touched nothing. I rarely used it. I'd built my 3-year disguise on staying invisible, not on spying. But sitting there with Jen's words still ringing in my ears, invisibility felt like the only weapon I had left. I opened the financial dashboard first, half expecting to find nothing unusual. Instead, I found a pattern that made my stomach turn. Over the past 6 weeks, a series of high-frequency capital transfers had been moving out of Jen's division, Strategic Partnerships, a department she'd built almost entirely from scratch after I invested in the company. The transfers were small enough individually to avoid automatic flags, but together they added up to a staggering number. And every single one of them routed through the same intermediary account, a shell company registered in Panama, with a name so generic it was clearly designed to blend into a spreadsheet and disappear. Meridian Point Holdings. I stared at the screen for a long moment, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Companies moved money through shell entities for tax reasons all the time. It didn't have to mean what I thought it meant. Then I noticed the approval chain. Every transfer bore 2 digital signatures. One was Jen's, the other belonged to Julian Sterling. My hands were steady, but my chest wasn't. I needed air, and I needed to think somewhere security cameras and curious eyes couldn't reach me. So I crossed the avenue to a small coffee shop that overlooked the plaza in front of Ethelgard Tower. It was the kind of place office workers used for gossip they didn't want overheard inside the building. Low lighting, mismatched chairs, a constant hiss of espresso machines covering half of every conversation. I ordered a coffee I didn't want and took a seat near the back, close to the patio doors, where I could still see the tower's entrance through the glass. I hadn't been sitting there 5 minutes when I heard his voice. Julian. He was standing just outside on the patio, phone pressed to his ear, half turned away from the shop, as if that made him invisible too. I recognized his tailored jacket immediately, the same one he'd been wearing that morning when he smirked at me in the lobby. He must have slipped out for a private call, thinking no one from the office would be within earshot. He had no idea I was sitting 15 feet away with a coffee cup as my only disguise, the same trick that had worked on my own wife for 3 years. The final sweep needs to happen before Thursday, he was saying, voice low but sharp with urgency. Once the new owner shows his face, every account gets frozen for review. We move it all before then, or we don't move it at all. There was a pause. I strained to hear the other end of the call, but of course I couldn't. I didn't need to. I already knew, with a sick certainty, exactly who was on the other end. She's already got the signatures lined up, Julian continued. His social, his tax ID, all of it. Once this hits, it points back to him. Unemployed husband, no verifiable income, suddenly $40 million richer overseas. Nobody's going to believe he didn't do it. $40 million. My own name. I sat completely still, my coffee cooling in my hands for the second time that day, and listened to a man calmly describe how he and my wife planned to destroy the rest of my life. It wasn't an affair anymore, if it had ever been only that. It was systematic theft, wearing my identity as its alibi. They weren't just betraying our marriage, they were building a prison cell with my name already carved into the door. Julian laughed at something Jen must have said. That same easy, comfortable laugh I used to hear directed at me across breakfast tables and late-night phone calls when we were newly married. "Relax," he said. "By Friday, you'll be running this company free and clear, and your husband will be somebody else's problem. The board will thank us for exposing the fraud ourselves. Hero, not suspect." He ended the call and walked back into the tower without a second glance toward the coffee shop, without the faintest idea that the man he'd just condemned to prison was watching him disappear through the revolving doors. I sat there a long time after he left, turning the information over in my mind, layering it against everything I already knew. $40 million. A shell company in Panama. My personal identification, weaponized against me. And an emergency shareholders meeting tomorrow, where I was supposed to walk in and reveal myself as the owner of a company my wife and her lover were actively looting. If I revealed myself too early, they'd simply shift the plan, cover their tracks faster, maybe even convince the board that I'd forced my way into ownership through some kind of manipulation. I needed proof. Not internal dashboards that could be explained away as routine business, but something undeniable, physical evidence, tying Jen and Julian directly to Meridian Point Holdings, something a courtroom couldn't argue with. I thought about the yacht Julian had bragged about buying last spring, the one Jen had once mentioned in passing as his little reward to himself. At the time, I'd assumed it was simply expensive taste. Now, I wondered exactly what kind of reward a stolen $40 million could buy. I finished the second cold coffee of the day, paid in cash so there'd be no card trail linking me to that shop, and started walking. Whatever proof existed, I intended to find it before the sun rose again, because for the first time since I'd watched my wife wave me away like an inconvenience, I understood exactly what she and Julian were planning to do to me. And I finally understood exactly what I was going to do to them. Finding the yacht wasn't hard. Finding a reason to be near it without raising suspicion took most of the night. I already knew its name, the Meridian Grace, a detail Julian had once dropped at a company dinner while bragging about his smart investments. At the time, I'd assumed it was just another rich man's toy. Now the name made perfect, ugly sense. Meridian Grace, Meridian Point Holdings. He hadn't even bothered hiding the connection, because he'd never imagined anyone would be looking closely enough to notice. I spent the evening pulling together what I needed. A set of plain coveralls from an all-night workwear store, a fake maintenance badge I printed and laminated myself using equipment left over from an old side project, and a burner phone loaded with nothing but a flashlight app and a secure recording tool. I wasn't infiltrating a fortress. I was infiltrating a party thrown by people who had never once considered that the husband they dismissed as harmless might be capable of anything at all. That blind spot was the only weapon I needed. St. Jude Harbor sat 40 minutes outside the city, a private marina reserved for people who considered public docks beneath them. By the time I arrived, the Meridian Grace was lit up like a small floating hotel, string lights strung along its upper deck, laughter, and clinking glasses drifting across the water. Through the windows, I could see Jen in a black dress I didn't recognize, holding a champagne flute, deep in conversation with a cluster of men I vaguely recognized as junior board members, the same men who would be voting on company matters at tomorrow's shareholders meeting. I walked the dock slowly, coveralls zipped to my collar, badge clipped to my chest, carrying a small toolbox I'd bought for exactly this purpose. Security at the gangway was light, one bored-looking guard checking names off a guest list, clearly not expecting trouble at a party this exclusive. I told him maintenance had flagged an electrical issue below decks that needed checking before the party moved to the lower lounge. He barely looked up before waving me through. Once aboard, I moved fast and quiet, keeping to the narrow crew corridors instead of the open decks where Jen's laughter kept drifting toward me like something aimed directly at my chest. I heard fragments of it as I passed below an open window. Her voice, bright and careless, telling someone that her husband had zero ambition and that once certain things were finalized, she'd finally be free to liquidate the house and start over properly. The guests laughed along with her. Nobody defended me. Nobody even hesitated. I kept moving. The master cabin was locked, but the lock was the kind found on every yacht in this price range. Expensive to look at, embarrassingly simple to bypass if you'd spent 3 years quietly learning things a company owner sometimes needs to know without anyone realizing he knows them. I was inside within a minute, closing the door softly behind me, my pulse louder in my ears than the party above. Julian's laptop sat open on the desk, screen dimmed but not locked, a rookie mistake for a man who thought he was untouchable. I connected the secure drive I brought, and while the transfer ran, I searched the cabin quickly, careful not to disturb anything. In a drawer, beneath a stack of nautical charts, I found a folder of paper documents, incorporation records from Meridian Point Holdings, wire authorization forms bearing signatures I recognized instantly, and a printed spreadsheet mapping exactly how the stolen funds had moved from Ethelgard's accounts into 3 separate offshore destinations. And then I found something I hadn't expected. Tucked behind the folder was a second document, smaller, more recent. A draft agreement, unsigned, outlining terms for something called a clean exit transfer. Language that, once I read through it twice, made my blood run cold. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was a plan to formally push majority voting control of Ethelgard away from the mysterious offshore owner entirely, using a legal loophole buried in outdated bylaws, effectively locking me, the real owner, out of my own company before I ever had the chance to reveal myself. They hadn't just planned to frame me for theft. They'd planned to make sure that even if I somehow proved my innocence, I'd have no company left to reclaim. I photographed every page, copied every file I could reach, and slipped the drive back into my pocket just as I heard footsteps approaching the cabin door. I ducked into the adjoining bathroom, heart hammering, and listened as 2 voices entered the room. Gen and Julian, alone for the first time that night. "You're overthinking it," Julian was saying, his voice lower now, private. "Tomorrow, the board sees the fraud evidence. They see the husband's signatures, and it's done. Nobody looks twice at us." "He's not that stupid, Julian," Gen said, and something in her tone made me go still. Not affection, not guilt. Calculation. "He's been quiet for weeks. Too quiet." "He's unemployed and heartbroken," Julian said, laughing softly. "That's not quiet. That's pathetic." I stood in the dark, listening to my wife's silence stretch a beat too long before she finally laughed along with him. And I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept until that exact moment. This wasn't a woman who'd stumbled into an affair and let ambition drag her somewhere dangerous. This was a woman methodically building a case against her own husband, brick by brick, while wearing his ring the entire time. They left the cabin a few minutes later, back toward the party, back toward guests who had no idea they were drinking champagne on a yacht purchased with stolen money. I waited until the corridor was clear, then made my way off the Meridian Grace the same way I'd boarded it, quiet, unnoticed, invisible. Walking back down the dock toward my car, the harbor lights reflecting on black water, I finally let myself feel the full weight of what I now carried. Not just evidence, proof of premeditation, proof of a plan to erase me from my own company entirely. Whatever Jen and Julian believed tomorrow's shareholders' meeting would deliver them, they were about to learn that the paper trail I'd just taken from that cabin would deliver something far different. By the time I reached my car, I already knew the next move wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about making sure Jen signed something of her own, something that would prove, in her own words, exactly what she intended to do to me. I got home before Jen did, which gave me exactly enough time to look like a man who'd spent his evening doing nothing more interesting than feeling sorry for himself. I changed out of the coveralls, hid the secure drive inside a hollowed-out book on my office shelf, an old trick I'd never actually expected to use, and sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of water I didn't drink. By the time I heard her key in the door, I'd rehearsed the version of myself she needed to see. Tired, wounded, harmless. Jen walked in still wearing the black dress from the yacht, though she'd swapped her heels for flats at some point, carrying them loosely in one hand. She didn't ask where I'd been. She didn't ask if I'd eaten. She dropped a thick stack of legal documents onto the kitchen counter with a sound sharp enough to make me flinch on purpose, even though I'd been expecting exactly this. "We need to talk," she said, not looking at me, already pouring herself a glass of wine. "Okay," I said quietly, letting my voice crack just slightly at the edges. I'd learned over the last 2 days that Jen responded to weakness the way sharks respond to blood, not with mercy, but with confidence. Confidence made people careless. I needed her careless. "There's been a financial audit at the firm," she said, sliding the documents across the counter toward me. "Some irregularities. My lawyers think, given everything, it would protect us both if you signed an emergency asset transfer, just to shield the house, just until this blows over." I picked up the papers slowly, flipping through pages dense with legal language designed to exhaust anyone who tried to actually read them. Buried in paragraph 14, disguised beneath layers of protective-sounding phrases, was the real purpose of the document. A master confession and indemnity release, shifting full legal liability for Ethelgard's missing funds directly onto me. Not the house, not our shared assets. My name, my signature, my future, signed away in exchange for nothing but her word that it would protect us. It was almost impressive how confidently she lied to my face while asking me to destroy myself in writing. "This sounds serious," I said, letting my hands tremble slightly as I held the pages. "What kind of irregularities?" "Nothing you'd understand," she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Corporate stuff, numbers. You just need to trust me on this one." Trust me? I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded slowly, playing the role I'd spent 3 years perfecting, without ever realizing it would matter this much. The gullible husband who believed his wife's success was too complicated for him to question. "If it protects us," I said, "then okay." Her shoulders relaxed, just slightly, and something in her expression shifted into something close to relief, though not quite tenderness. She slid a pen across the counter toward me, and I recognized it instantly as one of mine, a heavy, expensive-looking fountain pen I kept in my desk drawer, one I hadn't used in months. What Jen didn't know was that pen had been modified 2 days earlier by a private forensic consultant on my legal team, using a specialty ink that appeared identical to permanent ink under normal light, but would fade to nothing within 72 hours, leaving behind no trace of a legally binding signature. It was the kind of trick that sounded almost too clever to work outside a movie, but my team assured me it was standard practice in certain high-stakes divorce and fraud cases, precisely for moments like this one. I signed the document slowly, letting my hand shake for effect, watching Jen's eyes track the movement of the pen with something close to hunger. "This will save our future," she said softly, once I'd finished, reaching across the counter to squeeze my hand. Her fingers were warm, her eyes were not. "I trust you," I said, and activated the small voice recorder hidden inside my watch strap the moment her hand touched mine, a recorder my legal team had installed that morning, small enough to survive even a hug without detection. "You should," she said, releasing my hand and reaching for her wine glass again. "I know this looks bad right now, the freelance work not really going anywhere, the audit, all of it, but I promise once this settles, everything gets easier for you. You won't have to worry about money ever again." I wanted to ask her exactly what she meant by that, whether she pictured a future where I was in prison and she was free, or a future where I simply didn't exist in her life at all. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting her keep talking, because every extra sentence she offered was another sentence my recorder was capturing, another piece of evidence stacking itself neatly against her. "Julian thinks the board will be sympathetic," she continued, swirling her wine like she was discussing dinner reservations instead of dismantling my entire life. "Once the fraud evidence comes out tomorrow, nobody's going to blame me for wanting to protect the company from my own husband's mistakes." "Tomorrow," I repeated softly, as if I hadn't already known the date, circled in red on a calendar she'd never seen. "The emergency meeting," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about the details, just stay away from the tower tomorrow, okay? For your own good. Things are going to get complicated, and I don't want you caught in the middle of it." Caught in the middle of it, as if she hadn't spent 6 weeks meticulously building the middle out of my own identity. "Whatever you think is best," I said. She smiled then, and for just a moment, I caught a flicker of the woman I'd married 11 years earlier, before Ethelgard, before Julian, before ambition hollowed something out of her that I hadn't even realized was missing until it was already gone. It didn't last. The flicker closed as quickly as it opened, replaced by the calm, satisfied expression of a woman who believed she'd just secured her own freedom at my expense. She gathered the documents, slid them into her bag, and told me she was going to bed early, that tomorrow would be a long day. I told her I loved her. The words came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me more than anything else that night. Long after she'd fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about vanishing ink and hidden recorders, about a signature that would disappear in 72 hours and a confession that never would. Tomorrow, she wanted me far away from Ethelgard Tower. Tomorrow I intended to walk through its front doors like I owned the place, because I did. At 5 in the morning, the city outside was still dark, streetlights humming over empty roads as I drove to an unmarked office suite on the edge of downtown, the kind of building with no sign out front, no company name on the directory, nothing to suggest that anything important happened inside its walls. That was exactly the point. I'd set this place up 8 months earlier, long before I had any real reason to suspect Jen of anything beyond distance and distraction. Back then, it had simply been prudent, a private forensic and legal team retained quietly, paid through channels no one at Ethelgard could trace back to me, built for the sole purpose of protecting my identity until I was ready to reveal it on my own terms. I never imagined I'd need them for this. Inside, the suite looked nothing like the boardrooms I was used to walking past under an assumed identity. No glass walls, no skyline views, just plain carpet, a long table covered in monitors, and 3 people who'd been awake even longer than I had. My lead forensic accountant, a sharp, quiet woman named Keisha, was already pulling data onto the main screen when I walked in. Beside her sat 2 federal financial investigators, Agent Colton and Agent Reyes Marsh, brought in 2 weeks earlier once the first strange transfer patterns had caught my private team's attention, before I even knew Jen's name would be attached to any of it. "You look like you didn't sleep," Keisha said, sliding a coffee across the table toward me. I almost laughed. It was the 4th cup someone had handed me in 2 days, and the only one I actually wanted. "I didn't," I admitted, sitting down. "Tell me what we have." Keisha pulled up a timeline on the main screen, cross-referencing everything I'd gathered over the last 2 days, The internal transfer records from Jen's division, the physical decryption keys I'd copied from Julian's laptop aboard the Meridian Grace, and the incorporation documents for Meridian Point Holdings. The decryption keys were the missing piece, she said. We had transaction records before, but they were encrypted at the source level, which meant we couldn't prove who authorized each individual transfer. With these keys, we can unlock the full digital signature trail behind every wire. She tapped a few commands into her keyboard, and the screen filled with a cascade of authorization logs, each one time-stamped and signed. My stomach tightened as I watched 3 years of careful anonymity collide head-on with the ugliest version of my own life. Here, Keisha said, highlighting a section of the log. 3 overseas wire transfers, each one digitally signed under your credentials. Individually, $12 million, $15 million, and $13 million, routed through Meridian Point Holdings to accounts in Panama and Liechtenstein. $40 million. Exactly as Julian had said on the phone outside the coffee shop. Seeing it laid out in cold data made it feel more real than hearing it whispered on a patio ever had. They forged my signature, I said quietly. They tried to, Agent Colton corrected, leaning forward. But whoever built the forgery made one critical mistake. Digital signatures aren't just a name on a document. They're tied to device authentication, IP logging, and, this is the part that matters, precise timestamp verification against the originating network. He nodded to Keisha, who pulled up a second screen showing a building schematic I recognized instantly. Ithelgard Tower's internal security network, complete with camera feeds and access logs. Walk me through the timeline, Agent Reyes Marsh said, looking directly at me. Where were you, physically, at the time each of these 3 transfers was authorized? I already knew the answer before Keisha finished pulling the access logs, but hearing it confirmed out loud still sent a strange, cold satisfaction through my chest. All 3 transfers were authorized between 9:14 a.m. and 11:52 a.m. yesterday, Keisha said, scrolling through timestamps. According to Ethelgard's own internal security footage your wife personally ordered to be reviewed given the circumstances, you were seated in the lower guest lobby the entire time, under direct security supervision, on Genevieve Vance's own written instructions. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Jen hadn't just failed to give herself an alibi for framing me. She'd accidentally built me an ironclad one, ordering security to keep me visible on camera, sitting powerless on a bench at the exact moment the crime she was orchestrating required my supposed presence somewhere else entirely. She locked you out of the building, Agent Colton said slowly, and locked herself into a timeline that proves you couldn't have committed the fraud. She doesn't know that yet, I said. No, Keisha agreed. And based on what you've told us about the yacht documents, she's planning to present the falsified evidence at tomorrow's shareholders meeting, publicly accusing you before the board, using the framed signatures as proof. I thought about Jen's voice the night before, warm and convincing, telling me the emergency asset transfer would save our future, her hand resting on mine while a hidden recorder captured every word. I thought about Julian on the yacht, laughing about how the board would thank them for exposing the fraud themselves. Neither of them understood yet that every piece of the trap they'd built for me was about to become the exact mechanism of their own destruction. What about the exit transfer document? I asked. The one that pushes majority voting control away from the ownership entity? Agent Reyes Marsh nodded grimly. That's the part that elevates this beyond simple embezzlement, attempting to seize corporate control through fraudulent bylaws interpretation, combined with the wire fraud and the attempted identity-based frame job. That's a federal case with real teeth. We've already begun drafting the warrants. Timing? I asked. We can have everything ready to execute by tomorrow morning, Keisha said, which, if I understand your calendar correctly, lines up exactly with the emergency shareholders meeting. I looked around the table at the small, exhausted team that had spent 2 sleepless days turning my humiliation into evidence, and felt something settle inside me that hadn't been there since the moment Jen waved security over in the lobby. Then let's finish building the case, I said. Tomorrow, I walk into that boardroom exactly the way she told me not to. Keisha allowed herself the faintest smile. As Kaelen Vance, the unemployed husband? No, I said, standing, as the man who owns the company she just tried to destroy. Jen texted me at noon, which surprised me more than it should have. Dinner tonight, Bellevue Summit Club, 7 p.m. Want to celebrate a career milestone with you. Wear something nice. I read the message twice, sitting in my car outside the safe house, and felt the same cold clarity I'd been carrying for 2 days settle a little deeper into my chest. Jen didn't do sentimental gestures anymore, not toward me. If she wanted me at a dinner the night before the shareholders' meeting, it wasn't celebration, it was staging. I texted back a single word, okay, and spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing details with Keisha and the investigators instead of picking out a tie. Whatever Jen had planned for tonight, I intended to walk into it already knowing more than she did. The Bellevue Summit Club occupied the top floor of one of the city's oldest buildings, a place reserved for people who measured success by how difficult it was for anyone else to get a reservation. I arrived at 7, wearing the same old jacket I'd worn to the tower 2 days earlier, deliberately, and the moment the host led me to our table, I understood exactly what kind of evening Jen had arranged. It wasn't just the two of us. Julian sat beside her, relaxed and smiling, along with 3 people I recognized from Ethelgard's investor circle, the kind of high society board allies whose opinions could sway an emergency vote. Jen had built herself an audience. "There he is," Julian said warmly, as if we were old friends, rising halfway to shake my hand. I shook it. His grip was firm, confident, the grip of a man who believed tomorrow belonged entirely to him. "Kaelen, sit," Gen said, gesturing to the one empty chair, positioned slightly apart from the rest of the table, close enough to be included, far enough to look separate. A small detail, deliberate, like everything else about her lately. Dinner started pleasantly enough, the investors making polite conversation about markets and weather, Gen laughing in all the right places, playing the devoted, radiant executive wife for an audience that had no idea what she actually was. I ate quietly, said little, let her carry the room the way she clearly wanted to. It was somewhere between the second course and dessert that the evening turned. "Kaelen works freelance," Gen said to the table, in response to a question I hadn't heard, her tone light but pointed, like she was setting up a joke. "Graphic design mostly, small projects. It's sweet, really. Keeps him busy." The investors nodded politely, the way people do when they've already decided someone isn't worth their attention. I said nothing, letting the moment pass, watching Julian's smirk deepen from across the table. Then, reaching for her wine glass, Jen's elbow caught my wallet where it sat near my plate, sending it tumbling to the floor. It wasn't an accident. I'd watched her nudge it deliberately, her eyes flicking toward mine for just a fraction of a second before she looked away, already reaching to wave over our waiter. "Oh, sorry, that's my husband's," she said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, a note of amused embarrassment in her voice. "He's old-fashioned, still carries cash instead of using cards like everyone else." She turned to the waiter with a bright, apologetic smile. "Don't worry about splitting anything with him tonight. My guest won't be paying." A ripple of soft laughter moved around the table. I bent down, picked up the wallet myself before the waiter could, and set it quietly back beside my plate. Julian leaned across the table then, pulling a folded $100 bill from his jacket pocket and sliding it toward me with 2 fingers like a man tipping a valet. "Here," he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Take a taxi home after, yeah? Let the real professionals talk business. This part of the evening's going to bore you anyway." The table laughed again, softer this time, the kind of laughter that pretends to be gentle while drawing blood underneath. I looked at the bill sitting on the white tablecloth, then at Jen, who wasn't quite meeting my eyes, though the corner of her mouth was fighting a smile she didn't bother hiding completely. I picked up the $100 bill slowly, folded it once, and slid it into my jacket pocket without a word. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice calm, almost pleasant. "That's generous of you." Something flickered across Julian's face, not quite discomfort, but close to it, the faint recognition that my reaction hadn't matched the script he'd expected. Jen noticed it too. Her smile faltered for half a second before she reached for her wine again, covering the silence. I stood, buttoning my jacket, and looked directly at my wife for the first time all evening. "Every debt gets settled in full," I said quietly. "I'll make sure of it." I meant the words on more than one level, and something in my tone must have carried that weight, because for just a moment, genuine uncertainty crossed Jen's face, a flicker of the same instinct that had made her tell Julian on the yacht that I'd been too quiet lately. But the moment passed almost as fast as it arrived. She laughed it off, waving a dismissive hand toward the investors as if I'd made a harmless joke.
"He's dramatic when he's had a bad week," she said to the table, and the laughter returned, easy and careless. I said goodnight to no one in particular and walked out of the restaurant, past the maitre d', past the elevator attendant, down through the marble lobby and out into the cool night air, the $100 bill still folded in my pocket like a small, absurd trophy. I didn't call a taxi. I stood outside the Bellevue Summit Club for a long moment, looking up at the glowing top floor where my wife was still laughing with the people who'd helped her plan my destruction, completely unaware that federal warrants bearing her name had been finalized less than 3 hours earlier. Tomorrow, she believed, would be the day she finally became free of me. She had no idea how right she was, or how wrong she was about what that freedom would actually cost her. I didn't sleep that night either, but for the first time in 3 days, the sleeplessness didn't feel like dread. It felt like waiting for a curtain to rise. At 6 in the morning, Keisha called with an update that changed the shape of everything I'd planned. Jen and Julian, apparently unwilling to leave anything to chance before the shareholders' meeting, had driven out to Ethelgard Logistics, the company's port facility 20 miles south of the city, to personally oversee what internal chatter was calling a final data cleanup. My private security team, quietly monitoring the subsidiary's network as part of the broader investigation, had flagged unusual server activity originating from the site less than an hour earlier. "They're going after the transaction logs," Keisha said, "trying to wipe the internal record before you can present it to the board." I felt my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something close to relief. Jen and Julian believed they were closing the last open door before their story became permanent fact. They had no idea I was already standing on the other side of it. "Can we watch it happen?" I asked. "We already are," Keisha said. "The subsidiary's control room has remote monitoring access built into its server room, standard practice for a logistics facility that handles global freight scheduling. We've had eyes on it since the warrants were finalized last night." I drove to the safe house instead of the port itself. There was no need to be physically present for what came next, and every advantage in staying invisible until the exact moment I chose to stop being invisible. When I arrived, Keisha already had a live feed pulled up on the main screen. Grainy security camera footage from the server room at Ethelgard Logistics, alongside a real-time data stream showing every keystroke entered on the terminal inside. Jen appeared on screen a few minutes later, wearing a sharp grey blazer, moving through the server room with the brisk confidence of someone who believed she was the only person who understood what was actually happening. Julian trailed behind her, glancing nervously at his phone, clearly less comfortable with the technical side of what they were about to do. "You said this would be untraceable," Julian said. His voice picked up faintly through the room's audio feed. "It will be," Gen replied, sitting down at the terminal, pulling up the internal transaction database with the ease of someone who'd clearly done this kind of thing before, or at least rehearsed it thoroughly. "Once the logs are wiped, there's nothing left connecting Meridian Point to the transfers, except whatever's sitting on his personal devices, and we already know what's on those because we put it there." I watched the keystroke log update in real time on Keisha's second monitor as Gen began entering commands, each one appearing instantly on our side, mirrored and captured through the server backup system my forensic team had quietly installed weeks earlier as a routine security measure, long before I had any reason to suspect it would become the centerpiece of a federal case. "She thinks he's deleting the evidence," Agent Colton said quietly, watching over Keisha's shoulder. She's actually generating a permanent, time-stamped record of intent to destroy financial evidence during an active fraud investigation. Every command she enters just made the case stronger. On screen, Jen navigated through folder after folder of transaction records, selecting files in careful batches, pausing occasionally to explain something to Julian about audit trails and backup redundancies, clearly confident she understood the system better than anyone watching her. She had no idea that understanding the system wasn't the same as controlling it, and that every deletion command she issued was quietly duplicating itself onto a secure external drive miles away. "Delete confirmed," she said aloud, more to herself than to Julian, after entering the final batch command. On our screen, a small green indicator blinked, confirming the mirror had captured everything intact before the local copies vanished from the subsidiary's live database. "That's it?" Julian asked, sounding almost disappointed by how anticlimactic it felt. "That's it," Jen said, standing, smoothing down her blazer. "Tomorrow the board sees clean books, a legitimate audit trail pointing entirely toward Kaelen's personal accounts, and no way to trace anything back to Meridian Point. We walk in as the people who caught the fraud, not the people who committed it." I sat in the safe house, watching my wife congratulate herself on erasing a crime that had just been permanently preserved in triplicate, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel after everything. Not triumph exactly, but a strange, quiet sadness underneath the satisfaction. She wasn't stupid. She was thorough, careful, methodical in almost everything she did. And yet in her confidence, in her absolute certainty that she was the only one capable of understanding the systems around her, she'd walked directly into the exact trap her own overconfidence had built. "She's locking her own cage," Keisha said softly, echoing the thought forming in my own mind almost exactly. Jen and Julian left the server room a few minutes later, the feed showing them walking out together toward the parking lot, Jen already pulling out her phone to make a call, probably to confirm final arrangements for tomorrow's meeting, probably already rehearsing the version of events she planned to present to the board. She looked, on screen, exactly like a woman who believed she'd won. "Warrants are ready," Agent Reyes-Marsh said, closing his laptop. "The moment she opens that meeting tomorrow and presents falsified evidence to the board, we have grounds to move immediately. Wire fraud, attempted identity theft, obstruction, and now, as of this morning, deliberate destruction of evidence during an active federal investigation." I nodded, watching the frozen final frame of the security feed. Jen's confident stride captured mid-step as she walked out of a building she believed she'd just protected. "Tomorrow," I said quietly. "Tomorrow," Keisha agreed. I thought about the $100 bill still folded in my jacket pocket from the night before, about vanishing ink drying invisible on a signature she believed would ruin me, about a lobby bench where security cameras had unknowingly built me an alibi. Every trap Jen and Julian had constructed over the past 6 weeks had somehow, piece by piece, become the exact evidence needed to bury them. Tomorrow, the emergency shareholders meeting would begin exactly as Gen expected, with her standing confidently at the front of the boardroom, ready to accuse me publicly of a crime she'd spent weeks engineering. She simply had no idea that the man walking through those doors wasn't the husband she'd left waiting on a bench. He was the chairman she'd been reporting to the entire time. The 40th floor of Ethelgard Tower had a stillness to it that morning, the particular quiet of a room about to hold something enormous. I stood outside the double doors of the grand boardroom at 8:52 a.m., 8 minutes before the emergency shareholders meeting was scheduled to begin, flanked by 2 federal agents and my lead attorney, wearing a tailored bespoke suit I hadn't touched in 3 years. I hadn't worn it since the day I signed the papers that made me majority owner of Ethelgard Global. It had felt strange putting it on that morning, like slipping back into a version of myself I'd deliberately buried. But some things, apparently, you don't forget how to wear. Through the frosted glass of the boardroom doors, I could hear Jen's voice already carrying across the room, confident and clear, the voice of a woman who believed she'd already won. I glanced at my attorney, who gave a small nod, and at the agents beside me, who straightened slightly, ready.
Now, I said quietly. The doors opened. 30 board members and senior investors turned in their seats, and for a moment, nobody reacted to me at all. I was simply a man in a suit, walking into a room, unremarkable, unrecognized. At the front of the room, standing beside a large screen displaying falsified financial charts, Jen and Julian continued speaking, mid-presentation, not yet aware their audience's attention had shifted.
And as this data clearly shows, Gen was saying, gesturing at a chart labeled with numbers I recognized instantly as the doctored version of the $40 million they'd stolen, an outside intruder has compromised Ethelgard's offshore holdings. Specifically, she paused, noticing the shift in the room, following the collective gaze of the board toward the back of the space. Her eyes found me. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Not recognition of who I truly was, not yet, but something close to alarm, the way you flinch at an unexpected sound before you understand what caused it. Then it passed, and her expression hardened back into the confidence she'd worn all week. Speaking of which, she continued, raising her voice slightly, addressing the board directly now, while gesturing toward me with an open palm, as if presenting evidence. This is my husband, Kaelen Vance, the individual behind the fraudulent transfers currently under review. Security, please. Wait, I said, and something about the way I said it, calm, unhurried, carrying none of the fear she was expecting, made the room go quieter than her own presentation had. I walked forward, past rows of stunned board members, my attorney and the 2 agents falling into step slightly behind me. Julian's confident posture beside the screen had gone rigid. Jen's hand, still raised toward security, hovered uncertainly in the air. "Get him out of here," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "This is a fraud investigation, not an open forum." "You're right," I said, stopping a few feet from the front of the room. "It is a fraud investigation." My attorney stepped forward and placed a leather folder on the table beside the projection screen, opening it to reveal the company's founding ownership charter, a document Jen had certainly seen referenced before, in vague corporate summaries, always attributed to a reclusive offshore investor nobody in the room had ever actually met. "Members of the board," my attorney said, her voice steady and clear, "I'd like to formally introduce Kaelen Vance as the majority owner and chairman of Ethelgard Global, holder of controlling interest since the company's restructuring 3 years ago." The silence that followed was the kind you could feel physically, pressing against the walls of the room. Jen's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and then, as the reality settled, something close to horror. "That's not possible," she said, her voice thinner now, cracking at the edges. "The owner is anonymous. He's offshore. He's not." "I've been sitting across the breakfast table from you for 11 years, Jen," I said quietly, and watched the words land harder than any shouted accusation could have. "You just didn't think it was worth asking what I actually did with my days." Julian, to his credit, seemed to understand the shift in the room faster than Jen did. He took a small, involuntary step backward from the projection screen, his earlier confidence visibly draining from his posture. "This is a mistake," Gen said, turning to the board now, desperation creeping into her voice. "He's manipulating the room. This man has no verifiable income, no—" "Actually," my attorney interrupted gently, "Mr. Vance's income has been verifiable through Ethelgard's own confidential ownership records for 3 years. Records your division, Mrs. Vance, would have had access to review at any point had you chosen to look." The board members were exchanging glances now, some reaching for their tablets, others simply staring at Gen, with expressions shifting rapidly from confusion to something colder. "Security," Gen tried again, weaker this time. "Remove this—" "Actually," I said, cutting her off softly, "I'd like security to stay exactly where they are." I turned toward the 2 federal agents standing quietly near the door, who stepped forward now, badges visible. "Because there's something else the board needs to see." Agent Colton connected a small drive to the room's main display, and within seconds, the falsified chart Gen had been presenting moments earlier dissolved into a different screen entirely. The real transaction logs, pulled from the mirrored server backup, showing every wire transfer, every forged signature, every timestamp precisely matching the moments Gen had personally ordered me held in the lower lobby under security supervision.
"These are the actual records," Agent Colton said to the stunned room, "recovered as part of a federal investigation into wire fraud, identity-based fraud, and obstruction, currently being executed against 2 individuals in this building." Jen's face had gone completely pale now, her earlier confidence entirely collapsed. Julian had already begun edging toward the side door, though 2 more agents I hadn't noticed until that moment quietly blocked his path. "Genevieve Vance," Agent Reyes-Marsh said, stepping forward with the calm, practiced authority of someone who'd done this many times before. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, attempted identity theft, and obstruction of a federal investigation." The words seemed to hit the room like a physical weight. Somewhere behind me, I heard a board member whisper, "My God," under their breath, though I couldn't tell if it was directed at Jen, at Julian, or at me.
Jen turned to look at me one final time before the agents reached her, her expression no longer confident, no longer calculating, just stripped bare, searching my face for something I wasn't sure even existed anymore. "Kaelen," she said quietly, almost pleading, "why didn't you just tell me?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I did," I said. "You just never once thought to ask." Nobody in the boardroom moved for what felt like a long time after the agents said the words, "under arrest." Then everything moved at once. Jen's wine-glass composure from the night before was completely gone now, replaced by something raw and frightened that I almost didn't recognize on her face. She looked past the agents toward me, panic rising in her voice.
"This is insane," she said, twisting slightly as Agent Reyes-Marsh reached for her wrist. "I'm his wife. Our marital assets are protected. Whatever you think you found, it doesn't matter. Everything we own is shared.
It won't be once the board finishes reviewing this," my attorney said calmly, opening the leather folder again and withdrawing 2 more documents. She laid them beside the falsified charts, still glowing faintly on the projection screen behind Julian, who had gone completely silent, watching the 2 agents now flanking him with the stillness of a man calculating exits that no longer existed. The first document was our prenuptial agreement, signed 11 years earlier, back when neither of us had anything worth protecting except the idea of each other.
Buried in its clauses, largely forgotten by both of us over the years, was a provision voiding any claim to shared corporate assets in the event of proven infidelity, combined with financial misconduct against the other party. I hadn't thought about that clause in over a decade. My legal team had found it within hours of pulling the document 3 days earlier. The second document made Jen go very quiet. It was the emergency asset transfer agreement she'd asked me to sign 2 nights earlier. The master confession and indemnity release she'd believed would shift Ethelgard's missing funds entirely onto my shoulders. Beside it, my attorney placed a fresh printed copy showing the same page, my signature now completely vanished from the paper, faded into nothing, exactly as the specialty ink had been designed to do, leaving behind an unmistakably blank line where her scheme required my name.
"Vanishing ink," my attorney said simply to the stunned board. "Standard forensic practice when a client suspects coercion. Mrs. Vance asked her husband to sign away legal liability for a crime she committed. He complied, on the record, while quietly preserving proof that no binding signature ever actually existed." Jen stared at the blank line where her leverage had been, and something in her expression cracked entirely.
"You planned this," she said quietly, not to the board, not to the agents, but directly to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "This whole time, you just let me."
"I let you show me who you'd become," I said. "I didn't plan the affair, Jen. I didn't plan the $40 million or the shell company or the plan to make sure I had no company left even if I proved my innocence.
You did all of that yourself. I just made sure the truth had somewhere safe to land." The agents finished securing both Jen and Julian, reading them their rights over the low murmur of a boardroom struggling to process what it had just witnessed. Julian, to the very end, said almost nothing, his earlier confidence replaced by the blank, hollowed expression of a man realizing exactly how thoroughly he'd underestimated the people around him.
As they were led toward the door, Gen turned back one final time, agents guiding her by each arm, and looked at the room she'd once believed she was about to inherit. The boardroom she'd expected to walk out of as a hero, exposing a fraud she herself had orchestrated. Instead, she was walking out through the same lower lobby entrance she'd once used to have me removed like an intruder 6 days earlier, on the very first morning of all this. I didn't follow them out. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, in server logs and voice recordings and vanishing ink. In every piece of evidence Gen and Julian had unknowingly helped build against themselves through their own overconfidence. The board reconvened within the hour, shaken but functional, and I spent the rest of the morning doing something I never expected to do under these circumstances, formally introducing myself as chairman to a company I'd quietly owned for 3 years, answering questions from investors who were still visibly processing the scale of what they'd just witnessed. It felt strange, standing at the front of that room in daylight, no longer hiding behind an old jacket or a cup of cooling coffee. Strange, but not unwelcome. The federal case moved quickly after that, with the mirrored server logs, the yacht documents, the recorded confession, and the security footage proving my presence in the lobby at the exact moments the forged transfers occurred. Prosecutors described it later as one of the most thoroughly documented corporate fraud cases they'd handled in years. Jen's legal team attempted to argue diminished culpability, claiming Julian had orchestrated the majority of the scheme. The recordings from our kitchen counter, in her own voice, made that argument difficult to sustain. She was ultimately sentenced to 15 years, with her personal assets seized to help repay the missing capital. Julian received a similar sentence, his career and reputation dismantled almost as completely as hers. I sold the house a few months later, not out of spite, not as some final act of triumph, but because it had never really felt like mine to begin with. Just a place I'd shared with a version of Jen that, looking back, might never have fully existed at all. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that first morning in the lobby, coffee going cold in my hand, watching my wife wave me away like I was nothing. I used to think that moment was the worst thing that happened to me. Now, I understand it differently. It was the moment I finally saw clearly, not just what Jen had become, but what I was capable of when everything I loved was on the line. I built Ethelgard's disguise to learn how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. I never expected the answer would set me free.